You're listening to Working in Oncology, a podcast and video show that spotlights oncology practice staff and industry influencers who work behind the scenes to shape the future of oncology. The more knowledge the oncology community shares with each other, the more we all grow. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Working in Oncology. I'm your host, Alicia Evans. I'm joined today by Dr. Thomas Marron. He is the Director of Early Phase Trial Unit at the Tisch Cancer Institute and an Assistant Professor of Medicine at Icahn School of Medicine. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I am excited about our conversation today. I think a lot of our listeners are exposed to touch points in the clinical trial process, but I think you'll be able to provide a much deeper understanding.
I hope to help.
So before we jump in the show, Tom, can you tell our viewers a little bit more about you, your background, and what you do?
Sure. So educationally, my background, I have a PhD in immunology, and a lot of my work is focused on immune therapies, which are therapies that sort of harness the immune system to attack cancer. And I'm also a medical oncologist. And so on Fridays, I see what I call normal patients, which are patients that are not in clinical trials, and those are lung cancer patients. And the rest of the week, I lead the early phase trial unit, which basically is a collection of phase 1 and 2 trials that are looking at new therapies that were developed, typically in mice and in monkeys, and then they're being put into humans for the first time.
Wow. Okay. So you have both sides of it. You have the research side, and you also have the patient care side.
Yep. I get a little bit of everything.
Great. So there are thousands of oncology therapies in development, right?
Yeah.
Countless.
Yep.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the different categories? So what's new and upcoming that we should be looking out for?
So there's a lot upcoming. There's actually almost 5,000 different agents that are in development right now in the cancer space. So it's a very exciting space. That's actually almost a problem that we have so many different agents to look at. But, sort of taking a step back, when we talk about treating cancer, there's a few different ways to do it. And many times we're using what we call multimodality therapy. So we're using a bunch of different types of therapy all in the same patient to help improve the outcomes and hopefully improve the cure rates. So obviously, a lot of people know about surgery and radiation. The goal of those is to really kill a tumor and get rid of a tumor. But oftentimes, along with surgery and or radiation, we'll have to use chemotherapy. And that's sort of the classic therapy that we've been using for decades. And chemotherapy is really a bit of an umbrella term that talks about lots of different types of therapy, all of which are kind of, for lack of a better term, poison. Chemo is a very toxic compound that typically is more toxic to cancer cells, which are growing very fast, than the rest of your body. But it still does have a lot of side effects because it can be poisonous to normal cells, like one of the reasons why your hair falls out or why people might have nausea and vomiting when they're getting chemo. There's 2 different areas that are really growing fast and are kind of taking over the treatment paradigm for many of our patients. One is an area called targeted therapies. And targeted therapies are really geared towards patients who have a very specific change in their DNA, in their tumor, or also sometimes in their body. But usually, what makes cancer happen is that you get mutations or changes in your DNA, which is our genetic code that tells cells how to normally divide. And that might be just from bad luck, which is typically the case, or also from things like smoking cigarettes or, lying out in the sun too much and just getting exposed to lots of harmful radiation or chemicals that cause changes in your DNA. So there's certain types of cancer that have a very specific change in the DNA that allows us to use a medicine. Oftentimes they're oral medicines that can target that specific cancer cell. And those are nice therapies because oftentimes they're not as toxic to the rest of the body as chemotherapy might be. But unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of targeted therapies yet in our toolbox. And so most patients are actually not candidates for that sort of therapy. So everyone else, they get, the standard therapy, and the standard therapies for many types of cancer, lung cancer and kidney cancer, bladder cancer, skin cancer, now includes immunotherapy. And the way that immunotherapy works is it really activates your immune system to recognize the cancer as something foreign and attack it. So your immune system is there to differentiate between foreign things like COVID and self things like your skin and your hair and your lungs. And your tumor is somewhere, or the patient's tumor is somewhere in between those two. So they weren't born with their tumor, so it is foreign to their body, but it's not as foreign as coronavirus, for instance. But also what happens is that cancers find a variety of ways of putting up stop signs and keeping the immune system at bay, basically hijacking your immune system so that they can't attack the cancer. And so what most of our therapies, especially all the FDA approved medicines that you now see advertised on television, like Keytruda and Opdivo, those are all about tearing down stop signs that the tumor puts up that allows the immune system to then, attack and kill the tumor. And those are great. And they really revolutionized the way in which we treat many cancers, especially, today when we're reporting, it's a Friday, I just saw a lot of lung cancer patients, many of whom are receiving some of those therapies I just mentioned. And many of them are in, deep remissions. And we even have patients that in the past would never be cured of their stage 4 cancer. And now they're actually being cured thanks to immune therapy. So it's really revolutionized the way in which we treat cancer. But the reason I still have a job and the reason that we have these 5,000 drugs that are in development is that a minority, typically somewhere between 10 and 40% of patients, depending on the type of cancer they have, really benefit long-term from those immune therapies. And the rest of them, they might initially have a good response, but then unfortunately the cancer outsmarts our immune system or outsmarts the drugs that we're using and is able to grow. And so that's really where, I come into play is clinical trials and offering those patients who've, most of them or all of them really have already had the standard medicine, and then they come and see me because the standard medicine either didn't work or stopped working and they want to try something new.
Got it. Okay. So they've already had step 1. And so you're their alternative.
Exactly. And, some patients have just had one type of, chemotherapy or immunotherapy. And other patients, like breast cancer patients, for instance, oftentimes have had many different types of therapy because there's many therapies that are effective in breast cancer. And so it really depends on what type of cancer a patient has that dictates, how soon they might come and see someone running clinical trials such as myself versus just continuing with standard, FDA approved medicines.
Got it. And approval of all these wonderful new therapies are dependent on successful clinical trials.
Yes. Yeah. I always try to remind people that, every medicine that they've already received, most medicines we've received in our life, cancer or not, have all been developed using clinical trials. The same way that, a lot of people have learned a lot about clinical trials recently because of coronavirus. Everyone was, following with bated attention, phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. And now I feel like people are a little bit more versed in how clinical trials work, but it is, it's a complicated field and a lot of questions remain when patients come in and start trials.
Yeah. So we are often the guide for our patients in the clinical trial process. Can you kind of walk us through kind of deep level, a little bit deeper, how does the process work? And maybe if you could, along the way, give us some tips for helping to ease our patients through the process.
Sure. So, taking a step back, just the overview of clinical trials, there's phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. There's also phase 4 trials, but that's a different thing after something already becomes FDA approved. But so phase 1 trials, most of the early phase trials are phase 1 and 2 trials. And those are really geared towards doing 2 things. Looking, to see if the new medicine is safe. And oftentimes what we'll do is we'll do what we call a dose escalation, where we start at a very low level and we slowly work our way up, because we don't want to give somebody a brand new medicine that might be very toxic to humans, even though it wasn't toxic to mice and monkeys in which we tried it before. So that's phase 1 trials are really about what we call dose escalation, slowly working our way up in the dose and seeing if it's toxic. At the same time, we're hoping that we're not having any side effects we wouldn't expect. We are looking to see, is it working or not? Is it helping shrink the tumor? And what the next phase, which is phase 2, is where we decide what the optimal dose is. And that's really where we give it to typically many more patients. So typically at that point, we do dozens, sometimes hundreds of patients. We'll give the medicine to at a set treatment dose. And we'll say, all right, is this working or is this not working? If it is working, which unfortunately is a subset, but for the things that do seem to be working, then we oftentimes will have to do a phase 3 trial, the same way that they did phase 3 trials of the COVID vaccine, where they gave a certain chunk of people the vaccine and they gave another chunk of people a placebo vaccine, a fake vaccine, and they saw who got COVID. So that's typically how we do things in cancer. However, oftentimes there may be a placebo involved, But oftentimes what happens is patients will get whatever the standard therapy is versus this new therapy. So it's not necessarily a placebo. They might just get, a new type of chemotherapy, or an old type of chemotherapy, rather, something that we would use, if you were in a city that didn't have a clinical trials program, that would be what you were offered by your oncologist. It will be that versus, a new medicine. And in those phase 3 trials, which are not things that I run, those are more much larger trials, and they're typically run at different types of centers. Patients are randomized, which means that you kind of have to sign on a dotted line, commit to doing a trial, and then a computer system will assign you to either the new treatment or the old treatment. And sometimes it's blinded, which means that you don't even know, and your doctor doesn't even know which medicine you're getting. Are you getting the new one or the old one? So that's the final step in getting something FDA approved. But what I really focus on is what we call early phase trials, which is phase 1 and 2 trials, where we're really seeing, are these new medicines, toxic, and are they helping people, and do they seem to be shrinking tumors?
And so you're at that early stage. So there are certain hiccups that come in for the patient when they are participating in these trials. I know that sometimes navigating like exclusion criteria, that patients sometimes have questions about that. How do you navigate that in your office? What are your best practices for explaining that to patients?
Sure. So one of the most important things when it comes to clinical trials is a informed consent. And that is a process by which we meet with the patient and we go through a very long form that has lots of information about it, about the trial and about all the possible side effects and all the alternative therapies like a chemotherapy or a standard therapy. And we go through that. And at the end, there's a part where I sign and where the patient signs. And I always really emphasize this with patients, that it's not a contract, that you're not committing your life to anything. What you're really doing is it's a permission slip. So you're giving me permission to start the process of screening you and making sure that you are a good candidate for this trial. And at any point, the patient can tear up that contract or that permission slip and say, I don't want to do this. So when they sign, I always want them to realize that they're still the boss. They're always the boss. Even after they start treatment, they're still the boss, and they can always say, all right, I don't want to do this anymore. Once a patient signs a consent form and we go through the whole thing together, at that point we do something called screening, which is where we do a lot of tests, oftentimes blood tests, and sometimes we do new, CAT scans or MRIs or other imaging modalities. Sometimes we'll even do biopsies of the tumor. And that's all done to make sure that the patient fits all of the specific criteria, the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. And so any clinical trial has very specific rules about who can go on the trial and who can't go on the trial. And it's not that we're trying to be mean and exclude people, quite the opposite. We're trying to make sure that we're very inclusive, but that we're not risking people's lives while we're doing this trial. And we're not, risking putting people who may be very sick on a trial that may make them even more sick. And at that point, we don't know, is it the new medicine or is it just their cancer that's making them sick? So it's really to protect patients that we have these very strict rules. And these rules are, when we write a clinical trial, I write a trial, it's typically, a couple hundred pages. We submit it to the government before we open the trial, and the Food and Drug Administration has to give their stamp of approval and say that they are okay with us opening this trial. And as soon as they give us their stamp of approval, we can open the trial, but we have to do exactly what it says on that piece of paper. And so a lot of the times patients will say, can't you bend the rules? But it's super illegal for us to bend the rules. So we definitely have to follow those inclusion exclusion criteria to the T. But that really is the most important reason that we do that is to protect our patients. And so unfortunately, we can't offer a trial to everyone who comes and sees us. But our number one priority is never the trial and is never the company making the new drug. Our number one priority is always the patient sitting in front of us.
Awesome. So it's not personal. It's really for the patient's protection.
Yeah.
And also to keep you out of jail.
Important as well.
Which is pretty important. And so we talked about the consent forms. They're probably long. They're long. They're written in legalese. They're a little bit difficult to understand.
They try to write them. They try to write them in simple English. I personally, when I read them, I can barely understand them because I think that a lawyer's version of simple English is very different from my version of simple English. So I typically explain everything and then we go through the consent form because I feel like I'm doing a better job of explaining typically. And I think most physicians do that, is that we want to give a patient our idea of what the plan is. And it's also important for me that patients understand the mechanism of how these drugs work and what we think is happening inside of them if they are working, because I think it's an important part of the healing process to understand what these medicines are doing and, you know, what the possible side effects might be, just to really, you know, understand the mechanism that these drugs have.
So, I mean, they can make an informed decision.
Yeah.
So your tip would be to explain the consent forms and to also give a thorough explanation about the mechanism of the drug that.
Yeah, and the consent forms, unfortunately, oftentimes don't even really go into in-depth explanation of how the drug works. It's more, here's some possible side effects and here are the different, you know, clinic visits you're going to do, but it doesn't really give a lot of background, which I find to be, you know, important and reassuring to patients to know what's happening in their body and what's going into their arm. So
Absolutely. I mean, this is thorough consent then, right?
Yeah.
And then you also talked about collecting samples.
Yeah, that's something. So as part of any clinical trial, especially early phase trials, we do a lot of blood tests, and we do a lot of blood tests for two reasons. So one, we oftentimes will have people come in, you know, even if you get a treatment only every 3 or 4 weeks, at first we'll oftentimes have people come in at least every week, maybe every day for a week. And so you're going to see a lot of me. So, you know, just sort of take that in consideration when you're signing up for something. So there's a lot of visits, and then we do a lot of blood tests, and we do blood tests for two reasons. One is to check, you know, your organs and make sure there's no side effects with kidney or liver or anything else that we can check on a blood test, which we can't look for everything on a blood test, but we can look for some things. And the other thing is we take a lot of blood for research purposes. And that's because one of the things that we're doing while we're treating a patient in front of us, and obviously hoping that, you know, they do well, is we're testing how much of the drug is in their body and how quickly do they metabolize it, meaning how quickly do they clear it from their blood, do they pee it out, or, you know, however it's cleared. And so we have to do blood tests at regular intervals. And I always warn people, the tubes, because of this sort of fisheye approach, you know, the tubes are all kind of, they're all circular at the bottom, and the shape is circular. So it makes the tube look a lot bigger than it really is. And so some of these tubes look, you know, huge, and they actually only have, even our biggest tube only has 2/3 of a tablespoon of blood in it. So people will sometimes look at all the tubes I'm drawing and say, you're definitely a vampire. And I reassure them that even though I'm a pale Irishman, I'm not a vampire, and we're really just taking the blood for both safety purposes, but also for the research purposes. And when I say research, it's really just because we have to go back to the government and say, you know, yes, we are doing what we said we were going to do with this drug, and it's working for the following reasons.
So there's a reason for all of those blood samples.
Yes, yeah, it's not for our fun. We reassure people of that, but it's for safety, and also just to be able to make sure that we know that we are doing what we say we're doing.
Got it. Are there any other hangups or any other, but I would say stumbling blocks that come up for patients? Any major questions that they have that you run into fairly often?
I'd say the number one question that all of my patients have when they walk in the door is about placebos and if they're getting the actual treatment. And as part of a phase 1 and phase 2 trial, there are never placebos, maybe in phase 2 occasionally, but very rarely. And so everyone is getting the drug. There's no sugar pills, there's no fake medicine, there's no blinding. So, you know, I know exactly what you're getting, and you know exactly what you're getting. But it is important to know, I mean, at Mount Sinai, we do have phase 3 trials. And I know a lot of patients are very reticent to go on those trials. And I totally understand that. You know, it is the only way in which we can push the field forward to really test something against a gold standard, you know, kind of the the way it's been until now. That's the only way that we can really have progress. But it is the reality of phase 3 trials that you have to realize that you might be signing up and not getting the real thing. But in phase 1 and phase 2 trials, you're always getting the drug. We just don't necessarily know if it's going to work or not. So that's really the counterbalance, because in phase 3, you might be, in the trials where you might be randomized, those are the drugs that are most promising because they're most close to being FDA approved. And so you always have to weigh that. A lot of people also, they come in and they say, you're just treating me like a guinea pig, like I'm an experiment. And this is research. These are clinical trials. This is an experimentation of sorts because we're trying new things. But I want to reassure people that we're not ever experimenting on patients at their expense for other people. Our goal is always to help the person in front of us, along with helping, mankind by furthering knowledge. And it's important that people realize that. But it is, it is a commitment to doing something new, to taking a medicine that hasn't been proven to work, and in whom, we don't know what the side effects are. We don't know who it's going to work for. You are committing to a new therapy. And that's a personal decision that I don't think is fitting for everyone. And I think it's also important to find a doctor that you can trust and that you can connect with, and that, you feel like is going to be looking out for you while you're on trial.
Got it. So back to the placebo question, is my understanding correct that there is no sugar pill in these sorts of trials? You would just get the standard treatment rather.
So in my trials, we never have a sugar pill. So it's what we call a one-arm trial. So it's not like you're getting the new medicine or the old medicine. It's just the new medicine. And we might be going up on the dose. So different people get different doses slowly as the trial progresses. In most phase 3 trials, there are occasionally placebos, and this will be very explicitly laid out in the consent form. For legal purposes, they have to let you know there is a sugar pill in here. And it's important to ask questions about that and find out whether it's a sugar pill that is the alternate side, or if it's just another type of chemo or another effective therapy. Because many of the trials where you're randomized, they're actually randomizing between a perfectly good therapy, which is the standard therapy from here to China, and that exact same therapy plus something additional. And so I think those are great trials. Those are great randomized trials, because you're guaranteed to get the same thing that you would get even if you didn't sign up for the trial. It's just you have maybe a 50-50 or a 2/3 chance of getting an additional medicine on top of that may further benefit you. So we have many trials like that. It's just important, and I'm always happy that people come in and immediately ask that, because that's something that I think it's important that people know is the design of the trial. So are there multiple arms? Are there different treatments that you could get based on a computer or based on the design of the trial? It's important to go into it with your eyes wide open.
Got it. And then that goes back to a thorough reading and explanation of the consent forms.
Yep. Yeah, and I always, we always give a copy of the consent form after, we go through it with them and we both sign it, and then we give them a copy to take home. And I always give people, my phone number, and I tell them to email me or call me after they've read it if they have questions. Because as I said, sometimes they're rewritten by lawyers that make things less complicated or less simple than they should be. So it's important that people know what they're getting into.
Yeah, and I've definitely been in this situation where I've gotten home and reread something and said, no, I have questions about this.
Yeah, I would also if I read some of these things. That's why I always go through it with the patient, so that, I can point out very confusing parts of it.
We did talk about, you mentioned, did you say 5,000
new
therapies?
Yeah, it's an exciting, cancer is scary, and there's no good time to get cancer. So it's always kind of a cliche to say this is a good cancer to have, or this is a good time to get cancer. But, the way we treat, for instance, lung cancer right now in 2021 is radically different than the way that we would have treated it in 2015. And, we are in 2015, if you had stage 4 lung cancer, there was a near 100% chance that you would die of that cancer. Now, we're curing probably 20 to 30% of patients with lung cancer, which is extremely gratifying. And it's why I love my job and I love coming to work, particularly on Fridays when I see my lung cancer patients. But we still have a lot of room to grow. 20 to 30% is not 100%, and 100% is obviously the goal here. But it's exciting seeing, these 5,000 agents that are in development. And we just had, one of our big conferences last week, and that we saw, really rapid progress on many exciting new drugs. And I think that it's a very exciting time to be an oncologist. And, every time that we get a new medicine that further prolongs people's lives, it does two things. One, it obviously keeps people alive longer, but it also keeps people alive longer so that a year from now, when we have additional progress and we have additional new drugs, we're going to have a whole new option for them. So, it's oftentimes we may not be curing people, but we hope that we are at least, prolonging their life until we do in fact have a real cure for them.
And I like to kind of end my podcast on a happy note and a little bit of hope. So do you have any predictions for the future of oncology therapy?
Predictions?
What do you imagine for the future? What will it look like in 20 years?
So I do in 20 years. So a lot of the work that I do in the laboratory with my laboratory colleagues, which are right outside my office, we take a lot of those blood samples that we are getting from patients, and we bring them up to the lab and we're studying them because we're really trying to understand what is it specific about the patients that are doing really well versus those that don't have a great response. And one of the goals of that therapy is really to develop personalized medicine. And personalized medicine is a catchphrase. You hear it a lot in every field of medicine. But the goal, hopefully, 20 years from now, we're going to be able to do a biopsy of a tumor, and we can do, a biopsy of your blood or just a draw of your blood. And we can basically look at your immune system and look at your tumor, which both those things are completely unique. So everyone who I've ever seen has a totally unique immune system and a totally unique tumor. In the future, I hope that we can biopsy both of those and basically use an algorithm to predict exactly what the optimal therapy is, like how we can specifically treat them the best to get them the best clinical outcome and also the least toxicity possible, because some of these drugs do have side effects. So I think that we're already inching in that direction with I mentioned the targeted therapies where we are identifying these very specific changes in genes. But I think 20 years from now, it's going to be a radically different landscape where we really will be able to offer people, personalized approaches that optimize their care and give them, the best quantity of life and quality of life.
That would be incredible. Amazing stuff coming up. So, Tom, this has been such a great conversation. If any of our listeners want to reach out to you for any follow-up questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. Email is always the easiest for me because I'm never picking up my phone because I'm always with patients. But email is Thomas, THOMAS .Marron, MARRON @mssm.edu. That's our Mount Sinai email. So people can feel free to reach out to me with any questions or any concerns with clinical trials, definitely.
Great. So what I'll do is I'll just include that in the show notes. Right? So anyone can reach out to you. Tom, again, I want to thank you again. Thank you for joining us here on Working in Oncology.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Working in Oncology. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to leave a quick rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.